you read Protestant apologists talking about the Deuterocanonical books or the apocryphal books, sometimes they'll just use those two terms incorrectly as synonyms. They will sometimes say that, oh, this church father was for the Apocrypha and this other church father was against the Apocrypha, but that is vastly confused. Hi there, this is Dr. John Bergsma from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology and the Franciscan University of Steubenville. And this is the third in a series of videos clarifying why Catholic Bibles are bigger. Why so many videos on this subject? Because there is so much confusion out there. There are about 25 issues that need to be clarified about the larger list of books in the Catholic Old Testament. And when I look at discussions online about this, or even listen to people who have doctorates in theology or even doctorates in biblical studies discuss this question, inevitably there are confused uses of terminology, outright mistakes, erroneous information, etc. So we need to clarify. So in this video, we're going to try to clarify 3 more misconceptions about the larger list of Catholic Old Testament books when compared to the Protestant Bible. So the first misconception we want to clarify is that the Deuterocanonical books do not constitute a collection. A lot of people think of the Catholic Old Testament as composed of the books of law, the historical books, the prophetic books, the poetical books or the wisdom literature, and then the Deuterocanon, as if it's kind of a 5th genre division of the Catholic Old Testament. The Deuterocanonical books do not constitute a genre category, and they do not have any kind of internal connection with the others, except for example, perhaps 1st and 2nd Maccabees, because they're dealing with largely the same time period. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go through them. Okay, what are the Deuterocanonical books? Well, we have Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Tobit and Judith would be classified in the Bible along with other historical books. They're kind of biographical in character and would be close in genre to books like Ruth, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So we put them in as biographies lumped with historical books, leaving aside for the moment the question of are they really historical or not. That would be subject for a whole nother video or discussion. And then we have the books Wisdom and Sirach, which are wisdom literature, and they would go in that genre category along with other wisdom books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And then we have Baruch, which is a prophetic book and would go along with the prophets, and in fact traditionally was just considered to be part of the book of Jeremiah. And finally, 1st and 2nd Maccabees would also fit into the historical book category, and in some Catholic Bibles they are lumped with the historical books. And in other Catholic Bibles, they are just put at the end of the Old Testament to serve as kind of a historical bridge into the New Testament era. So again, the Deuterocanonical books are not a genre category. They don't hang together. And among the Church Fathers and in antiquity, they weren't considered a collection. And here's where you'll find a lot of confusion. When you read Protestant apologists talking about the Deuterocanonical books, or the apocryphal books, sometimes they'll just use those two terms incorrectly as synonyms. They will sometimes say that, oh, this church father was for the Apocrypha and this other church father was against the Apocrypha, but that is vastly confused because the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon was not considered a collection. You got to go book by book. And it gets to be very confusing because some church fathers quote and affirm some of the Deuterocanonical books, but reject others. And it's not a clear-cut situation because these were not considered to be a collection where it was either thumbs up or thumbs down with all 7 of them. The second misconception that we're going to clarify in this video is the idea that the Deuterocanonical books of the Catholic Church were part of an Alexandrian canon. Now, there's some truth to this, but there's also some misconception here, so we have to talk about this and clarify a little bit. Now, in antiquity, during the time of our Lord and in the centuries leading up to the life and career of our Lord, as well as in the centuries immediately after, the largest group of Jews in any city outside of the Holy Land, or Israel, was located in Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt was the New York of its day. It was a large city and had a very, very large population of Greek-speaking Jews. We call Greek-speaking Judaism Hellenistic Judaism, and Alexandria, Egypt was the largest center of Hellenistic Jewish culture in the ancient world. And of course, you may also know from history that Alexandria, Egypt had the largest library in the ancient world, and the sacred books of the Jews were indeed translated for that library and placed in that collection. So what you'll hear scholars sometimes say is that there was a Palestinian canon, or a list of inspired books observed by Jews who lived in Palestine, and then there was a list of inspired books accepted by the Greek-speaking Jews of Alexandria, and that's termed the Alexandrian canon. And there is some truth to that, inasmuch as the Jews who are living in the traditional territory of Israel during the life of our Lord and in the centuries immediately thereafter, many of them accepted a smaller list of inspired books, whereas the large, prosperous Greek-speaking community of Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, by and large, did typically accept a larger list of inspired books. However, things were not very clear-cut. There weren't authorities that were able to make clear decisions and write up lists, and a lot of it just refers to what was traditional or what was custom. So, for example, in Alexandria, Egypt, it's true, many of the Jews there did accept a larger collection of inspired books, but it was very fluid. There was not a clear-cut list. So, our copies of the Septuagint, for example, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament books used by the Alexandrian Jews, all of our copies of the Septuagint vary in their order and in the exact number and identity of books that they include. Now we're going to get into some tall weeds here, but hang with me. When we're talking about the ancient Greek Bible, often called the Septuagint, and I'll just do an entire video on that subject later, just on the Septuagint. But again, we're talking about the ancient Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint. We have three major copies of it extant, that means in existence. Those copies are called Vaticanus, which is kept in the Vatican, Alexandrinus, which was found in Alexandria, Egypt, but is now kept in the British Museum in Britain, of course, and then Sinaiticus, which was found at St. Catherine's Monastery on the traditional site of Mount Sinai, but also is kept today in the British Museum. All three of these manuscripts, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Sinaiticus, include copies of the Greek Septuagint, we usually call it, as well as the Greek New Testament, and they come from the late 300s or the early 400s. None of them have exactly the same collection of Old Testament books. Vaticanus, for example, is missing all of the books of Maccabees, although it has the other Deuterocanonical books. Awkward. Then you've got Alexandrinus, which includes all the books of Maccabees, including 3rd and 4th Maccabees, and it includes 1st and 2nd Clement in the New Testament. And then you've got Sinaiticus, which is missing in the Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Embarrassing. But it does have 1st Maccabees and 4th Maccabees, but not 2nd Maccabees and 3rd Maccabees. So you see that things were messy back in the day. folks translated the books that they had available. And the poor scribe that was composing Sinaiticus, for example, he must just not have had copies of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings available to him. So he couldn't include those, but he had these other books, and so he put together as much as he could. And this is true of a lot of these issues in the ancient world. Things were just messy. They were not as clear-cut. Prior to the establishment of the Catholic Church, there was no pope to make clear decisions, etc., etc. So, yes, the Greek-speaking Jews of Alexandria did have a larger group of books that most of them considered inspired, and the Jews in the Holy Land had a smaller list of books, but the boundaries were very fluid among both groups, and there was a lot of mess. The third misconception that we're going to clarify in this video is that the Deuterocanonical books were rejected because they were not written in Hebrew. That is simply not true. What is true is that some of the Deuterocanonical books were not written in Hebrew, so 2nd Maccabees, for example, or Wisdom. It is true they were written in Greek, but that is not why they were rejected. On the other hand, several of the Deuterocanonical books were written originally in Hebrew, and among those we could include Baruch and 1st Maccabees, and even Sirach. But again, it didn't really play into whether they were rejected or not, because there was not a criteria in the ancient world that an inspired book had to be written in Hebrew. Of course, we as Christians accept many inspired books that were not originally written in Hebrew, and that would include our entire New Testament, all of which was written in Greek. While I'm at it, let me throw another clarification in here, because along with the language in which they were originally written, some people will say, well, the Deuterocanonical books were written because they did not have propheticity, or they were not composed by a prophet. That simply does not work. There was not a criteria in the ancient world that every biblical or every inspired book had to be written by a prophet. If there was such a criterion, then the book of Ruth and the book of Esther would not have made the cut, because they neither claim nor were they written by prophets, and so that was not a criteria. So what was the criteria by which a canonical book was determined? That subject deserves an entire video by itself, and we'll return in a future episode to discuss what St. Augustine says about the issue.